There are a number of themes in the film, and of course, nuclear war and the real possibility of it is one of them. The end of the film and Vera Lynn singing "We'll Meet Again" is of course a tribute to Stanley Kubrick and his wonderful film Dr. Strangelove. In one sense, there is already nuclear war, because the threat of nuclear war is part of warfare. And once one country that is nuclear armed threatens by whatever means, in whatever form, another nuclear armed country, that is nuclear war. And it's almost as if we've got out of the whole milieu of thinking about nuclear war. Go back to of course, the 1980s, the Great Freeze movement. Before that, in the birth of C&D in the 1950s, but then bring it on through the 1990s. There was always a suggestion which we had to really adhere to in our calculations about so much, that nuclear war was a real possibility. It's quite extraordinary how the discussion of this has been almost eradicated from public discourse. And I think that's perhaps one of the things we might like to talk about today. Why? Why has it? Why? We're in a very privileged society. We can find out things if we want to. We can come and see films like this if we want to. Why has it been eradicated? And I would suggest there has been another war going on, and that is a cultural war. A war against finding out. A war on memory. A war against any real form of dissent. And I don't mean single-issue dissent, however noble that might be at the time. I'm speaking about the kind of dissent that marshals our intellect and our sense of ourselves against the prospect of extinction. And you heard Stephen Starr, one of the world authorities on the nuclear winter, talking about that. Now, we're not told that in response to this so-called pivot to Asia, which has been quietly going on, actually since 2009, it was really the idea of Hillary Clinton, who was almost president. And there might be some people who are regretting that she isn't at the moment. By gee, she had some interesting ideas for going to war. And she really declared that whole South China Sea area an area of American national interest. So this has been building for quite some time. The reaction in China has not only been to build these airstrips in the South China Sea, clearly that's a reaction to it, but it has been to change its nuclear armaments policy from low alert to high alert. I think we know almost nothing about this. That means that the warheads and the missiles are no longer kept separate. That's low alert. They're put together. That's how it is in the United States, that's how it is in Russia. The Chinese, up to fairly recently, kept their nuclear weapons on low alert. They've changed that. They've begun to develop the kind of anti-ship missiles that would be devastating if they were attacked. Also, we're not made aware, or at least we're not, yes, I suppose we're not made aware, of the great changes that have happened in Western policy. In December 2016, Congress quietly, only because we didn't know about it, and I don't think many Americans did, took the word limited out of the prospect of nuclear war. The first strike policy is now policy. It has actually been since the 1990s, since a document which was only partly declassified recently revealed. But here we have last year the publication of the Law of War manual by the Pentagon, which made it clear that first strike. Now what this actually means, if a country that doesn't have anything like the capacity, the military capacity of the United States, and that's China still, felt that it was about to be attacked, it would retaliate with nuclear weapons. That's what makes this all so right. But we've some way to go, I think, before we get to this situation. But the fact that we're not discussing this in open societies like this one is something that should concern us all. That's enough from me at the moment. Would anyone like to? Yes?
I did the intermediate certificate in '62 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the feeling even among 14, 15-year-olds was just an overpowering feeling of doom, which nobody seems to have these days. But the question I was going to ask you was, if China is such an enormous threat, why are we allowing huge Chinese investments in our infrastructure, residential and agriculture in Australia?
Well, the question is, if China is such a huge threat, why are we having such trade? Well, China isn't a threat. It's ridiculous and insults our intelligence, insults our sense of ourselves. It isn't a threat. And until recently in China, they were quite bemused by the idea that they were thought of as a threat, a military threat. They understood about challenging the dominance of the United States in economic terms, yes. So in answer to your question, I mean, in Australia, we have this conundrum, I suppose, of do we go along with the United States, to which we're sort of grafted onto in just about every way, and almost literally, and military is integrated. The integration is almost total. Again, I don't think many of us realize how closely integrated we are. The base that isn't an American base, Pine Gap, is probably the most important base of its kind in the world, in laying the ground in intelligence for a major confrontation. It's also, Pine Gap, as Edward Snowden revealed, is used to pick out the targets for Barack Obama when who felt like assassinating people every Tuesday with his drone campaign. So it's a conundrum for us because we need China. We're all, as well as Eric Lee, near the end there, said the connection between the United States and China is almost irrevocable in so many ways. Well, it is true now between Australia and China. It's an utterly 21st century situation where the problems are making sure that a big guy doesn't roll over us in terms of trade, or goes and takes our land, or takes much of our minerals, or we cheat our indigenous people of our minerals and so on. They're 21st century issues in many ways, but into this has come a 19th century issue, a 20th century, which is the United States, wearing modern versions of pith helmets, a gunboat policy. That's what all that is about. When you have American admirals and Joe Biden and all the others coming to Sydney, and the New South Wales police stopping traffic on the Harbour Bridge so that their motorcade of these potentates can sweep through. Interesting how we don't protest about that. We seem to have lost the idea of mass protest in that sense, how humiliating that is. How they come down here and tell us, really, get ready, you know, you've got a new enemy. Well, we don't have a new enemy. Maybe the enemy's within. The Turnbull government is planning $492 billion worth of arms acquisition over the next 10 years. Now, when you think of what has been cut back in so-called austerity measures, $492 billion, which will include buying these American F-35 Turkey, flying turkeys, because no one really knows how to work them yet. But we're buying them because Australia always buys those things. This is a completely artificial situation, and especially in a country like ours, which has no enemies. I mean, if you wrote this down as a play, there's a country where the leader of the country is spending $492 billion on arms acquisitions and it has no enemies. Well, why? But we would have an enemy if we sided with the big guy across the Pacific.
Hi, my name is Beata Stelf, and sorry for coming in late, I got horribly lost, but congratulations on an outstanding documentary. I can see it certainly opened my eyes to lots of things, and I can certainly see how important it is to get this message out to people. And unfortunately, the mainstream media propaganda just doesn't do it. So the question is, have you ever, or have you considered going to an institution like Harvard, because I know they have speakers like yourself, where the students are mainly American, but they have international students, but that is going to be our future leaders. And so I would hope that maybe something would come across at that level. Is that a possibility? Harvard University. Yeah. Have you done it, or have you considered going there to do a presentation for the students?
I have spoken a lot in the United States and shown my films, and to very dynamic audiences, I have to say. Whilst I understand what you mean, it's important that the elite, which are at Harvard, understand this. Look, if Harvard asked me to go and speak there, I probably would, but they haven't. But I have spoken to, as I say, to similar institutions. I think in the end, there's such a disorientation in our societies, in the United States, probably especially, certainly in this one, when we finally wake up. I mean, Australia is asleep most of the time. But when we're not asleep, the same campaign against us is to confuse us, is to kind of eviscerate any forms, real forms of understanding and reflection. And this is true. If you look at the way the Turnbull government has smashed the arts, $300 million cut from the arts, that has an ideological reason. It's not about austerity, not really.
I've got a daughter studying politics there, and we discuss this sort of thing all the time. And she has mentioned about different speakers that come and talk.
Yeah.
She said it's very popular amongst the students. So
Yeah.
I'd be hoping that this sort of
Yeah,
might go a little bit more mainstream within America, which hopefully...
Well, I think it's a very good idea. I agree with you, and I do speak and show films at various establishment places in the United States and in the UK, at Oxford and Cambridge and other universities and so on. So, but thank you for suggesting that.
Thanks, John. Great documentary.
Thank you.
5 days ago, the Philippines government made a statement saying that the disputed islands don't belong to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this seems rather conciliatory, and in light of the fact that the Philippines have been ceded jurisdiction over the islands. So the question I ask is that are minor countries, like the Philippines, who have the trigger point in their area,
Mm-hmm.
and that of Australia, who contains quite a number of bases for Americans, do they have a role in peacemaking in this rising temperature?
The new president, Duterte, he has demonstrated this by, personally he's quite a colourful character who's got a dark side, no doubt, but it's interesting to see the hysteria towards him because they don't really care about the way he deals with the drug problem in the Philippines. What they care about is that the Philippines are suddenly woken up, and it appears are saying you can't have the bases here, at least on a long-term basis, and we'll go to China and talk about these disputed reefs and islands. There's about 5 countries have claims to these islands, but none of these other countries have been targeted by the United States, including Vietnam, which has been quite aggressive in its own way towards trying to get back some of these islands. But the role of the Philippines really demonstrates, the present role, the change in the Philippines demonstrates how small, strategically placed countries can play such a critical role in turning away this entirely unnecessary threat. I'm not sure that we in Australia realise just the significance of what's happened in the Philippines, that it's gone from being an utterly obsequious, its government has, colonial state, to one that is at the very least volatile now politically in terms of the United States, its former colonial master. So, look, whatever their political stripes in Asia, the countries of ASEAN, the countries from Indonesia all the way through to China, but they don't want the idea that there should be some big power clash in a region that has seen the most horrific bloodshed and has seen the dropping of the atomic bombs and and the terrible carnage of wars, none of them want it. None of them want it. And in my experience, and it doesn't only apply to Asia, that most disputes in the world between states and nations, if they're kept regional and there is a regional broker, they can, if not be resolved, but they can get to a stable point.
John, I'm sure you would agree, and I think many people would agree here, we cannot go on following this United States military machine into war after disastrous war. We've got to stop. We need an independent and peaceful Australian foreign policy which looks after our interests and doesn't involve us following along in the United States' footsteps. And there is something we can do. There's lots of things we can do. But one thing I would like to suggest to you, and I'll give us this leaflet out at the door when you go, there's a proposal to put an advertisement in a major Australian newspaper calling for, what's it say? Keep Australia out of US wars. This is to be signed by 1,000 people, and the whole statement is here on this leaflet. And I'd like you to consider. We need to take a stand and do something, don't we? Not just listen. We're inspired by John's film. We have to do things. Well, this is one little thing. To put something in the paper saying we need to keep Australia out of US wars.
Thanks for that wonderful movie, John. It's certainly a great eye-opener to many of us here. You said that Australia has no enemies, but the way the USA behaves towards Australia, I wonder whether the USA is really a friend. And you mentioned the $450 billion of war machines, effectively, that Australia has been pressured to buy. The fact that every year we subsidise mostly US oil and fossil fuel corporations $41 billion a year of Australian hard-earned taxes, and many other examples following them into war, as was just mentioned. What is it that, given that our main economic partner is actually China, what is it, or what is the mechanism, do you think, that's used? You've mentioned the cultural wars, and I think we face a cultural war by the USA on Australia in many respects to follow them. But what do you think is the mechanism that the USA uses to convince our political leaders to follow blindly in their path?
I don't think they have to convince them. Our political leaders have always been out the front, put their hand up saying, please, can we be in your war? That goes back to, Menzies' fake invitation that he claimed to join the Vietnam War. Virtually every colonial war we've been involved in, it's we colons in Australia who have done the running, and to such a degree that some of the United States has often found us just a little bit too eager at times. So I don't think there's any convincing. Our political leadership is completely integrated into that. But for the rest of us, I believe there is a cultural war, and I believe it is a war against finding out. If anyone really regards the general media, the corporate media, as a source of information, apart from the odd bit of interesting corruption in New South Wales here and there, and other service things like sport and the weather and so on, then they really are deluding themselves. And it was quite interesting to see, and Mr. Trump, for entirely other reasons, declared the media the enemy of the people. And they were so affronted. They're so affronted. Trump, in a perverse way, has spoken so many truths that he doesn't realise, perhaps, the extent of them. Because we have, I think it is a war against information, a war against democracy. I mentioned earlier the attack by the Abbott and the Turnbull governments on the arts in this country. And the arts are not some abstract, esoteric, rarefied thing. I'm talking about denying Indigenous communities and isolated communities the kind of regional art support that make them proud of their own situation. We have people who are mentally ill, people who are disabled, being denied. There are something like 16,000 people now who will be denied regional centres that we don't hear anything about throughout this country due to the massive cutbacks that the Arts Council of Australia and all the other groups that have tried to encourage and bring the arts to isolated groups. I found that with my film Utopia, the distribution of Utopia was very interesting because I decided to bypass the media with it. So what's the point? They're going to attack it anyway, so why bother? We got together a group and we offered the film to anyone who could show it anywhere in the country. We'd provide the film, they provided the venue. That was the deal. And started with something like 4,000 people turning up on the block in Redfern to watch it. Then it went into tiny places all over the country. Now, I had feedback from Indigenous people and others who saying they'd seen it about 20 times, you know, sat there and watched it. Because the idea of something like that coming into our regions, into our outback, into our isolated communities, wasn't all that common. And so it was bringing information in. That's just my personal example. That's what we should be getting behind, getting information, the arts, bypassing this propaganda machine called the mainstream media, which is only really corporatism dressed up. You know. Yes, some of it's okay, of course, there are honourable exceptions. You know, I work within it in many ways, not in this country. But, you know, overall, it's not going to do us any favours, quite the opposite. It's bypassing that and getting information out to people all over this country.
Is it only the Green Left Weekly that publishes your articles?
Well, Green Left has been publishing my articles for quite a while, probably, let's see, on a regular basis, yes, it is. I'm not sure I'd be terribly happy if it was published, if they were published elsewhere now. I'm not sure I'd want to keep that company.
Thanks for the film and for your life's work. It's been a real pleasure to be here tonight. You kind of answered my question a little bit in what you were just talking about then, but I was just kind of generally wondering about information and the truth, and obviously with the recent election and everything in America, there's this whole fake news and opin news, I think was a term done to the Washington News this morning, which is quite an interesting idea.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering how, in your lifetime as a journalist, you'd seen information change, and obviously with Tim Berners-Lee giving us the internet and things like this, and how things have evolved to where they are now, where the main populations of of countries that use things like Facebook, and they're kind of running around like headless chickens. They don't know where to point to or where to look for the truth. I guess also in certain, I think Russia, they also use that as a political tactic to sort of displace populations by feeding them information that isn't necessarily the truth. It's just they get there first, and just how you've been witness to seeing how information has changed and how it's been used to manipulate populations.
I don't think basically, I think what's changed is the means.
Yeah.
That's really what's changed. I think this has always happened, manipulation. You know, I grew up with a pretty restricted media, well, newspapers, television at the beginning, and movies and so on, not too restricted really, but the manipulation in all of those was pretty raw, pretty direct. I do think many people understood that at the time, in the way that people in totalitarian societies understand that their media lies to them. So it's not an issue. They know it. The media, lies to them. That's why they have secret or theatre, and that's why in the Soviet Union they had Samizdat, and it's not an issue. The problem for us over all these years is that we really think it doesn't happen, but it happens much more effectively than it happens in totalitarian societies. That's something that, in my opinion, every school child should understand. They should understand how to navigate their way intellectually through the barrage of information, how to deconstruct what is presented as information but is really propaganda.
So I think that's the problem that what I'm seeing on multimedia is that people are being fed this and they don't know where to go.
Yeah.
They don't know what's right and what's wrong. There's two sides and then there's the truth. And, and so people are kind of giving up and just thinking, let's just leave it to someone else to deal with because I don't know what's going on. And I'm just wondering what advice you can give people that are seeking the truth, looking for the real news rather than...
No, I would say it's up to them.
Yeah.
And that kind of passivity is not on, really.
Yeah.
It's not on in privileged societies. Oh dear, we've got this from here. What can it be? Well, use your brains, have a look, find out. There's some extraordinary stuff on the internet that tells you. And it's no good, this perpetual hand-wringing. I'm not saying you're doing that. No. Perpetual hand-wringing. I realise that there's been this sort of media by obfuscation, we had during the Obama years, for example, we had what's called identity politics in the service of war. Now people had to understand that yes, of course identity politics the issues are good and right and everything, but they were in the service of something, as Obama was in the service of something. And that's why people are so confused about Trump. Here comes a cartoon character who's basically just a cartoon version of everything that's gone before. There are differences, of course there are. But we had the Guardian newspaper the other day writing this laudatory editorial about George W. Bush. Remember him? Remember W and all the jokes and everything? He was the Trump of then. It was ridiculous. It's understanding a system and where these people come from and what they represent in our lives. Too much of social media is us. it's like looking in a mirror all the time. You can't do anything about that. When a teenage boy or girl wanders around with their phone like this, well, okay, you can't stop that, nor should you. But there is a part of their enlightenment should be that there is something else to all this information and what it means to them, you know?
And they shouldn't necessarily be surprised that a person like Trump becomes elected. And
No.
continues
Or be
to
surprised that someone like Obama's elected.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Why was Obama elected? Well, Obama was elected because he was the first African American president in the land of slavery. End of story. End of sentence. Nothing else. Obama was the product of Chicago's Southside Democratic Party's machine, and he performed beautifully in that role. Made a bit of a mess up of a few things, conducted more wars than any other president in history, 7, that's not bad. Increased spending on nuclear weapons when he said in Czechoslovakia in 2009 that he was going to help the world get rid of them. So it's understanding behind this media facade of the nice Mr. Obama, and we feel so pleased an African American as
I
president.
think it was 20,000 drone strikes.
What?
20,000
Yeah, 20,000 drone strikes with according to the Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who blurted out that he'd killed 4,700 people. He used to do it every Tuesday afternoon and select the victims. That's a nice Mr. Obama. Now, compare him with the nice Mr. Trump. Well, why do we have these people? Why do we have the nice Mr. Turnbull compared with the nice Mr. Abbott? Abbott, you know, was a sort of cartoon character. Turnbull, a lot of people actually thought Turnbull was civilised, you know. Apparently not.
I have enough questions.
Okay. Anyway, thanks.
Yeah, great film, John. Really great film. 2008, I asked you a question up in Katoomba when Jack Thompson had the Gearings Hotel and the place was
Oh
packed.
yeah, that was a good event.
It was a great event.
Yeah.
It was a fantastic event. And I asked a question about history, burn memory, which you've touched on when you've come out here.
Yeah.
I've written a book called History of Man's Past, but I pay a bit of a tribute to you and other people's wars. The whole thing about why is Australia involved in wars on behalf of the British Empire, America and so forth. And one of the first films that I saw you do on TV with the ABC back around 88 with the bicentenary bullshit was other people's, that was the last room that third party
Yes.
had other people's wars.
That's right.
And you interviewed Brian Day, who was
Yes.
a warrant officer in the SAS.
Yes.
And he was with the Americans and Special Forces in Vietnam as well as serving in Cambodia.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got that scene with, he's talking to this place in Hazelbrook about that American officer he knew. He said, "We like you guys being here." And he goes, "Well, what do you mean by that?" "Well, the British have got the Gurkhas and we've got the Australians."
Yeah.
And
Perfect analogy.
yeah, well, one thing I
Yeah.
did a long interview and I've transcribed that in the book. From
Australians are slightly better paid.
Yeah, well, one question I've got related to your film, but one other thing I want to say. I was teaching out west at Wellington at New Dubbo, and I really enjoyed teaching HSC Aboriginal Studies and showing Utopia.
Very good.
And the kids really got into it, and just
Good.
the way it was, that whole thing. So
Very good.
that's something we do as teachers.
Right.
But the question I've got, and I've got it in the book too, I touch on Malcolm Fraser, no radical by any stretch of the imagination, but he was making the point about Australia getting out of the alliance with the United States, shutting down Pine Gap. Didn't say all the bases, but he certainly mentioned Pine Gap. He also mentioned
Yeah.
removing the American military forces from Northern Australia.
Right.
Because I thought for someone like him who was a war minister in Vietnam in the army
Yeah.
at the time, it was quite a big shift in his life.
Yeah. Well, look, the establishment are worried. Paul Keating, is barely a day passes when he doesn't pop up and say, we've got it all wrong over China. Fraser was saying that. You know, there are sane people among them, but that's, I think that suggests how extreme it's got. That, I mean, even the government, I see Julie Bishop has recalled all the ambassadors. I mean, I'd like to be a fly on the wall, what she actually says to them. The idea of Julie Bishop briefing all Australia's ambassadors doesn't fill one with absolute wonder, but it suggests the disorientation, the confusion extends not only amongst us here, it extends to the establishment themselves. They're disorientated. I think that is, we're at a period in history where we're moving from social democracy in the West into corporate states. Many of us, we've progressed to the point where we now have corporate states. We virtually have that in Australia, where you have two major parties that virtually are the same, few minor differences here and there, but basically they're corporate parties, and that's become a corporate state. We used to be a social democracy, we're not anymore. And I think that is the confusion that now exists amongst people. Who are we? What are we? What does democracy mean anymore? It's why a lot of people, you know, let's dismiss it, says the media, with a word called populism. Well, that's quite an honourable word in many ways. So I think that's the period we're in.
I want to say thank you very much, Mr. Pilger, for this movie. The documentary was really impressive. I remember watching a movie, War and Democracy.
Yeah.
That was very quite impactful, very insightful.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask, we only briefly mentioned Trump in your film.
Yes.
Considering that one of his aides, Steve Bannon, has previously written and wrote about how America will eventually have a war with China in the next 10 years. He's now one of the aides. Trump has now increased military spending by $58 billion, but he's also done a lot of non-interventionist rhetoric, as he's promised on, no more wars, no more intervention.
Yeah.
Is that purely empty rhetoric, or do you think he could still very much continue the war hawk policy that was similar to the Bush administration?
It's a good question. The answer is I don't know. I think that everyone's second-guessing Trump at the moment. He's entertaining in a sort of grotesque way, but it is, with his tweets and so on. But there's something, what is not accepted, though, is that there is a major internal factional fight going on in the United States. The people who really are the power of that great monolith called the national security machine want to get rid of Trump. They want to get rid of Trump for one reason only. Well, they don't like him. The other reason, his personality is unpredictable. He can't be quite manipulated as Obama was. He's not of it as George Bush was, or blackmailed as Clinton was, and all the rest of it. He's unpredictable, so that's a major problem. But the major problem is that Trump has, the one consistent thing that Trump has said is that he wants to do a deal with Russia. He wants to have a détente again. Détente is a word from the post-Cold War, for those of you who don't remember, and it meant that Russia and the United States effected treaties with each other to not blow each other up, and decided not to go to war with each other. Deals were done. Trump has made clear right from the beginning he wanted to do that. That's why all this nonsense about Russia intervening in the US election campaign, of which there is not that much evidence, that's what this is about. So it makes the situation, the US, rather more interesting that it's presented as simply yet another bad man, yet another archdemon. That doesn't mean to say makes Trump a good man or anything. He's terribly odious on just about every level you can think of. But there is this about him. And that is, how that's resolved is terribly important, because I think the prospect of a war with Russia is greater than a prospect of a war with China. But it involves keeping NATO intact, keeping the armaments industry intact, keeping all the pillars of the US establishment basically upright. Trump threatens him by wanting to make peace with Russia. Now because we've got out of the habit of actually thinking about politics other than in terms of personalities, I think that's worth our consideration now and where that's going. That's my view at the moment.
And just one more would be, could you foresee a potential conflict between America, or at least NATO, and Russia?
Well, yeah, I could foresee it. Wouldn't last very long if it included nuclear weapons. You saw what would happen.
I have been in all these peace campaigns in Germany about East and West political conflicts, and in America, and about Third World and first so-called Third World, First World, etc. And this movie has more clearly demonstrated to me that there is no more political conflict. It is only economic conflict. Yeah. If you know about Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq and all that stuff, underneath is only economic questions finally, and that is so shocking. There is no more real democracy or political emphasis. And whether it's climate change, whether it's indigenous justice, and the cleanup of our act in this country, where I've been now 32 years, it is finally economics. And it makes me so depressed. I started crying so much when I saw this movie, because it makes it more clear than ever that the conflict with China is an economic conflict. So how can you express the
it's also a tribal,
the hope that you still
well,
have that democracy or civil society is alive and we can make a difference?
Well, you've been making a difference all your life by the sound of it. There's the hope in yourself. Just keep doing it. No, sorry, you can't have the word. No one gives the word, only you know. And you know better than anybody. If anyone knows, you know. Aye. It's the theme through most of my films has been the struggle of people against power, almost echoing the famous Milan Kundera quotation. So, and that, I believe, is what journalism, I believe that journalists should be agents of people in truly free societies, not agents of power. And most journalists in the mainstream are agents of power. And that's, I don't repeat that to myself every day. You happen to ask me. I have been asked before. And it comes down to that fairly simple answer. Also, with every project, every film, or whatever I'm doing, the privilege becomes reinforced by the fact that I meet the most extraordinary people, like those people in Okinawa, like those women on the Marshall Islands, like those amazing people on Jeju Island. I once wrote a book called Heroes, and the heroes were people who, against extraordinary odds, perhaps they didn't succeed, but they almost and sometimes did. And that's just a privilege. And when we asked ourselves, as you have, what should we do? we should first ask ourselves, what do I do with the privilege I've got? And I've always considered being a journalist an immensely privileged thing. My father didn't have the same privileges when he worked in his working life. He worked for a boss. I've had bosses, still have them, but I still have this privilege. And in using that privilege, it's given me an enormous amount of satisfaction over the years. Thanks for asking. Thanks, Rob. Thank you.
Before we wrap up, I just wanted to say there's another event coming up here which may be of interest to some of you. It's the Whitlam Oration. The Whitlam Oration this year is on the 16th of March, and it'll be given by Stephen Fitzgerald, who was our first ambassador in China. He's written a fantastic book called Comrade Ambassador, and the title of his oration on the 16th of March is Managing Ourselves in a Chinese World, Australian Foreign Policy in an Age of Disruption. Sounds like it's got a bit of media and sort of things in there as well.
Yeah.
Interesting enough, in his book, he talks about how that period after the war with Menzies and so on, essentially, China and Asia was seen to be something that, if it wasn't an enemy, it was something we looked down on. It was only when Whitlam came in that we changed all of that, and we started to see Asia and China as equals and something we needed to engage with. And so it was a very important part in Australian history when a young man at that time in his early 30s became our first ambassador. We began to engage with China, which I think your film suggests too, get in there and engage and don't sort of turn them into sort of demons and something else. John, I wanted to, this is your 60th film, which I think is amazing that it's your 60th film. So I think, round of applause. I'm going to have a couple of last questions. I wanted to turn it back onto you, because you often turn the question on to big world issues. Over the years, of which there have been quite a few, how do you think you have changed as a documentary filmmaker? Why did you start to do it, and why do you still do it?
Well, I began as a journalist at the age of 18, and I considered when I got my cadetship on none other than the Daily Telegraph here, which wasn't owned by Murdoch then, but was owned by somebody of similar outlook, Packer. I regarded that, frankly, as I look back on that as one of the happiest days of my life. That I was suddenly invested with this privilege of being a journalist. And I've always regarded myself as an old-fashioned journalist and filmmaker, and then I went on to make the parallel careers, making films. But it's the theme through most of my films has been the struggle of people against power.
It really is a privilege that, in a sense, you don't sort of like just resort to social media. You actually bring it to the people, and on this occasion to the people in Parramatta, so I've got the alliteration in. But it has been a privilege having you here tonight, and actually not only seeing your film, which is a statement in itself, but actually hearing you talk about it, because it's really hearing, in a sense, what you said. It's the people in behind these things that make all this thing. It's the people in behind your film, which is you, which actually makes this particular event tonight a privilege, but also a very fine event that I think most of us will go away and think about for quite some time. I'm still thinking about Utopia when you were here last time, and I'm sure we'll be thinking about this film for many, many years ahead. So on behalf of the audience, I thank you, and can we all just join in thanking John?
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.